Somewhere over the English Channel in the winter of 1944, a solitary American fighter slipped down through a tear in the overcast ... below. 9 German machines maintained tight formation. Completely unaware of the shadow drifting toward them ... the Corsair's engine had been pulled back to an almost inaudible murmur ... its pilot had applied colours to the airframe that no technical order had ever sanctioned ... the first German pilot to perish never glimpsed what ended him. Neither did the second ... by the moment the formation broke apart in panic. 3 aircraft were already tumbling ARTHWARD ... The question that tormented Allied intelligence for weeks afterward was stark and straightforward. How does one airplane become invisible in an utterly open sky? The winter of 1944 settled over Western Europe with a special kind of mercilessness. Thick fog banks drifted in off the channel, heavy as soaked wool, filling valleys and clinging to hedgerows until midday. When the sun finally pierced through, it brought almost no warmth, only pale illumination sufficient to expose the grey, exhausted breadth of a continent locked in total or ... above this sombre landscape. The air campaign had reached a brutal, attritional climax. American heavy bomber streams crossed into occupied Europe every day, their condensation trails carving white scars high across the stratosphere. Below them, at medium levels, escort fighters traced protective orbits.
Lower still, wherever the cloud deck fractured and reformed, reconnaissance machines and fighter bombers prowled, hunting targets of opportunity. The English Channel functioned simultaneously as thoroughfare and cemetery. Every transit carried mortal hazard. German fighters operated from fields across northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Radar stations studded the coast. Flak batteries guarded every bridge, rail yard, marshalling point, and fuel installation. For American aviators, the arithmetic was pitiless. Each mission eroded the probability of returning. The presence of United States Marine Corps aviators in this theater was distinctly anomalous. The overwhelming majority of Marine pilots waged war in the Pacific, where the island-hopping strategy required intimate close air support and carrier-based operations. Yet a modest detachment had been seconded to combined operations in Europe, conducting missions that spanned escort duties to direct ground attack. They arrived equipped with aircraft engineered for an entirely different theater. The Vought F-4U Corsair had been conceived for the immense distances of the Pacific. Its enormous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp produced more than 2,000 horsepower, conferring the velocity and climb performance required to intercept Japanese fighters at great range. Its inverted gull wings, necessary to accommodate the huge propeller while keeping landing gear, short enough for carrier operations, created a silhouette unmistakable against any sky. In European service, the Corsair constituted a genuine curiosity. Most American fighters operating over France and Germany were P-47 Thunderbolts or P-51 Mustangs, machines that had become emblems of Allied air supremacy. The Corsair's appearance provoked interest from both allies and adversaries. German pilots had memorized recognition charts crowded with American types. Yet the distinctive bent-wing profile of the Corsair appeared infrequently enough to sow genuine confusion. That confusion would prove decisive. The pilot who would exploit it had been flying combat for nearly 18 months. His name appears in squadron logs and after-action summaries, although many particulars of what transpired were deliberately clouded by wartime security requirements and the general disorder of a conflict approaching its final, decisive phase. In the weeks preceding the mission in question, he had become fixated on one fundamental problem. How could a lone fighter meaningfully improve its survival probability when facing numerically superior opponents? The orthodox response was unequivocal. Avoid such situations altogether. Engage only when holding advantage. Never fight alone against a formation. These maxims had been inculcated in every American pilot since primary flight training. Yet war seldom delivers ideal conditions. Sometimes fate arranges to place one aircraft against many. Wingman engine failure, weather scattering a flight, navigational error, the anarchy of a swirling dogfight dispersing pilots across hundreds of cubic miles of airspace. When such moments arrived, textbook doctrine offered scant consolation, so the pilot turned his attention to something else. He studied how he was perceived. Before the war, he had been a painter, not professionally, but a young man who devoted weekends to canvas and oils, rendering landscapes near his family's home in rural Pennsylvania. He understood light in ways most people never pause to consider. The manner in which morning sunlight could transform an ordinary hillside from flat green into a complex interplay of shadow and highlight. The way fog softens edges until solid objects seem to fuse with their surroundings. The way the human eye instinctively seeks high contrast and recoils from uniformity. He entered a small college in 1939, intending to study engineering. The practical choice, his father had declared. Art was acceptable for leisure. A man required a profession. The arrangement pleased no one completely, but it provided structure during years when the world was beginning to burn. News from Europe arrived in disjointed fragments, Poland overrun in weeks, France collapsing the following spring. Enduring nightly bombing alone. The young engineering student followed these developments with the same distant interest felt by most Americans. The war was genuine, but it remained remote. An ocean provided both barrier and alibi. Pearl Harbor abolished the distance. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in January 1942, 3 weeks after turning 21. The choice of service was intentional. His older brother had served in the Marines during the late 1930s. Family tradition carried weight beyond mere logic. Aviation selection occurred 6 months later, when aptitude testing revealed the spatial visualization abilities his painting had quietly cultivated. Flight training consumed the following year. Primary in bright yellow Stearman biplanes, basic in more demanding machines, advanced in fighters. Each stage culled candidates ruthlessly, washed out for air sickness, washed out for sluggish reflexes, washed out for inability to withstand the mental strain of close formation flying. Attrition hovered near 50%. He survived each elimination with respectable though never outstanding marks. Instructors recorded adequate stick and rudder ability, sound situational awareness, and an uncommon habit of asking questions about aircraft systems that exceeded the prescribed syllabus. He wished to understand not merely how to operate the machine, but why it behaved as it did, why certain camouflage patterns were selected, why cockpits were laid out in particular ways, why some aircraft remained visible far longer than others at distance. These inquiries marked him as either unusually inquisitive or mildly troublesome, depending on the evaluator. His initial combat tour came in the Pacific, where the air war above Guadalcanal and the Solomons had become a daily grinding contest of exhaustion. He flew Corsairs against Zeros and Vals and Bettys, absorbing the brutal lessons no syllabus could adequately prepare one to receive. He learned that combat unfolded faster than cognition, that decisions executed in tenths of seconds determined survival, that the enemy was not an abstraction, but other young men in other cockpits, equally frightened, equally resolute. He learned that survival frequently hinged on variables beyond skill, weather, fortune, the capricious trajectories of through three-dimensional space. He also discovered something that would later prove essential. He was easier to see than his adversaries. The realization crystallized during a mission over the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands that served as the principal Japanese reinforcement route. His flight had been directed toward a reported convoy, only to discover empty sea. On the return leg, a formation of Japanese fighters dropped from superior altitude, evidently having acquired Americans from great distance. The brief engagement that ensued produced no decisive result. Both sides exchanged passes without significant loss. Yet in the debriefing, one detail persisted in troubling him. The Japanese had acquired them first. They had maneuvered into perfect ambush position, with a precision implying prolonged visual contact. He began questioning why American aircraft of 1943 wore camouflage patterns devised by committees. The rationale behind those schemes was rational within the detached atmosphere of procurement offices, but it frequently failed when confronted with the actual geometry and lighting of aerial combat. Standard Navy and Marine Corps fighters carried a two-tone finish, sea blue above, intended to merge with ocean when viewed from overhead, lighter gray-blue beneath, intended to blend with sky when observed from below. National insignia, a white star within a blue disc, appeared in prescribed locations on wings and fuselage. The pattern functioned adequately for its intended role. Ships glancing upward saw defending fighters that melted into overcast. Submarines scanning the surface saw shapes that faded into sea horizon. The scheme had been engineered for the horizontal domain, where danger originated from the sea, but air combat almost never remained planar. Fighters climbed, dove, rolled, presented every conceivable aspect to observers. At those angles, the sharp demarcation between upper and lower colors produced distinct visual edges that the human visual system detected with extraordinary efficiency. The pilot started keeping meticulous notes. After each mission, he documented the precise conditions under which he had first acquired enemy aircraft and the conditions under which he himself had been acquired. He recorded sun angle, cloud type and coverage, altitude differential, approach direction. He sketched the relative positions of aircraft at the instant of first sighting. Patterns gradually emerged. Machines silhouetted against bright sky remained visible at extreme range. Machines viewed against dark ground became far harder to track, but the most revealing observations concerned intermediate conditions. Aircraft operating at similar altitude against mixed cloud and blue backgrounds displayed dramatically different detectability depending on paint scheme and orientation. He concluded that the issue was not absolute brightness. The issue was contrast. The human visual system is optimized to detect edges and discontinuities. In evolutionary terms, such edges frequently signal danger, a predator emerging from cover, a precipice ahead. The system is highly sensitive to abrupt transitions in hue, saturation, or luminance. Standard aircraft camouflage, paradoxically, created precisely those transitions, the boundary between sea blue and sky gray. On a Corsair fuselage formed a clean, trackable line even when the colors themselves partially matched the background. The white star insignia, necessary for identification, functioned as a long-range high-contrast beacon. The pilot began to grasp that he was not merely flying an aircraft. He was flying a conspicuous target. Meanwhile, the Pacific campaign was evolving. American advances through the Solomons and toward the Philippines had been bought at enormous cost. Each captured island yielded new airfields and eroded Japanese range advantage. Yet the toll in pilots and machines remained punishing. Intelligence indicated that Japanese replacement pilots were arriving with progressively fewer training hours and diminished combat preparation. This degradation should have, and in many respects did, confer advantage to the Americans, but it also produced a secondary effect. Less experienced pilots depended more heavily on basic pattern recognition for target acquisition. They searched for the familiar shapes and color arrangements they had been drilled to recognize, and American aircraft painted in regulation schemes supplied exactly those cues. The pilot began contemplating what might occur if those cues were systematically removed. The notion crystallized during mail call in spring 1943. A parcel from home contained art materials his mother had assembled at his request. Brushes, small tubes of oil color, a pigment mixing guide he had used in. His tent mates naturally assumed he planned to create paintings, landscapes perhaps, or portraits to mail home. The assumption was logical. Many servicemen pursued creative outlets during idle hours, but the pilot had a different purpose. He commenced with modest experiments, cardboard fragments painted in various patterns, held at arm's length and studied against different backdrops. When film permitted, he photographed the results for comparison. He requested and studied engineering techs on optical perception and human vision through the unit library system. The findings corroborated his intuition. Uniform colors, even those closely matched to background, still produced distinct, trackable shapes. But patterns that interrupted the object's outline, that disrupted the figure-ground boundary, rendered the object markedly more difficult to detect. Nature had mastered this principle over millions of years. A tiger's stripes are not arbitrary. They fragment the animal's silhouette against vertical grass stalks. A leopard's spots dissolve its form amid dappled forest light. Counter-shading renders fish nearly invisible from above or below. Why should aircraft be exempt? He presented his observations to the squadron commander in June 1943. The response was courteous but distinctly lukewarm. The commander observed that aircraft camouflage fell under Bureau of Aeronautics specifications. Individual pilots lacked authority to alter appearance. Moreover, non-standard markings risked serious identification confusion. Friendly fire incidents already occurred with disturbing frequency. Introducing additional variables would almost certainly exacerbate the problem. The pilot accepted the decision without protest. He did not, however, abandon the concept. He simply shifted approach. He could not repaint the aircraft without approval, but he could study more rigorously. He could accumulate evidence. He could construct a case that might eventually persuade higher authority. His transfer to the European theater arrived in late 1943 as part of a small Marine detachment attached to Army Air Forces units for joint operations. The reassignment interrupted his experiments but opened new possibilities. European conditions differed profoundly from the Pacific. Weather varied more dramatically. Terrain offered different visual backgrounds. Enemy fighters wore camouflage philosophies refined through years of continental warfare. German machines carried upper surfaces in mottled grays and greens, undersides in pale gray or light blue, patterns that had evolved through empirical testing to suit the forests, fields, and cities of Central Europe. American pilots frequently reported that German fighters were difficult to acquire against ground clutter. The mottled schemes broke up outlines far more effectively than the solid American colors. The pilot noted this carefully. His opportunity materialized in January 1944, when his squadron was temporarily based at a small makeshift forward airfield in southern England. The field had been carved from farmland with minimal bureaucracy. Maintenance personnel were chronically overworked, primarily concerned with keeping aircraft airborne rather than enforcing cosmetic regulations. He approached the crew chief responsible for his Corsair with a careful proposition. The aircraft had sustained minor battle damage during a recent sortie and required repainting in any case. What if the necessary touch-up included some modest experimentation? Nothing permanent. Nothing that could not be reversed if directed. Simply some trial patterns that might offer tactical advantage. The crew chief was wary but not hostile. He had previously flown as a waist gunner on B-17s until a back injury grounded him. He understood the stakes of aerial survival more viscerally than most desk officers. If the pilot believed the modification might increase his chances of returning, the chief was prepared to exercise discretion. The work commenced the following night. The Corsair rested in a sandbagged revetment at the field perimeter. Partially concealed beneath canvas tarps, the chief had arranged to shield the unauthorized alterations. The pilot labored during the small hours when base activity reached its lowest ebb, and his presence near his own machine would attract minimal notice. Paint was obtained through liberal interpretation of supply channels. Some came from standard aircraft touch-up stocks. Some from ground vehicle maintenance. Some was mixed from pigments bartered from nearby British units. The resulting palette consisted of grays, muted greens, and dark blues never contemplated by any official specification. The pilot's method synthesized everything he had learned. The fundamental scheme preserved darker upper surfaces, but now those surfaces were fragmented by irregular patches of lighter gray and subdued green. Color transitions were deliberately softened and feathered, eliminating the hard edges his tests had proven so detectable at range. Undersurfaces received parallel treatment. Instead of uniform light gray, they carried subtle tonal variations that imitated the actual appearance of overcast sky. Regions of brighter and darker gray shifting with viewing angle. The national insignia posed a special difficulty. It could not be eliminated without creating grave recognition hazards, but it could be subdued. The pilot reduced the white areas with near-white paint that lowered contrast while preserving legibility at closer range. The blue disc was slightly enlarged, and its edges diffused, disrupting the perfect geometric form that the eye so readily tracked.